Hi, welcome to chapter 22 of the Inwood Markings Garment Company vlog, aka Joe tries to find a secluded place to film in Melbourne that is somewhat scenic. Thank you to anyone who's watched anything of this. It is chapter 22 today. If you go to inwoodmarkings.com, you'll be able to see the YouTube link for the other 21 chapters, which isn't mandatory to watch, but what I talk about today will certainly make a lot more sense. So I've actually had to, things start to get a lot more hectic now, as I've said in previous chapters, and there's sort of a bit more haziness around timeline and exact details, but as always, I'll make it clear when I'm unsure of something, etc. So yeah, I'm going to do my best, because like with all of this, I didn't document enough at the time. Like, there were synchronicities that I documented which I didn't think were synchronicities when I documented them. I just found it interesting that this series of meetings occurred, and there's been bits and pieces here and there, but overall it's mostly undocumented, so the significance has only become apparent in hindsight, and so I've had to kind of rely on my memory, which is solid, I have to say. And so yeah, I will do my best. Excuse me. And so yeah, I'm just going to be referring to some notes today. So I left off with the second ghost experience of 2018, which is also the second, I guess, typical ghost experience of my entire life, and so that second one involving the USB is especially significant, even though all of them have been, because it was the threshold. It was like the line was kind of drawn in the sand by the universe, if you like, regarding the transition from my freelance role and things to do with my previous life into creativity. You'll remember from the dream that I now realise is premonitionary, that it was shown to me that the future is creativity, and I imagine that's not just for myself, but potentially broader. Overall, this time period feels like the transition between the previous life and my life presently, and this is kind of like a key part of that overall transition. So what I was also doing at the time was I was attempting to write short stories, and even considered writing about my life. And the short stories were connected to things that had occurred in my life, but a family member had encouraged me to pursue that course. But I realised after this second ghost experience that I wasn't doing it out of an innate kind of need or desire, but instead I was doing it as kind of like in the interest of kind of, if you like, keep the peace with my familial relations, I guess. And so I also ceased that. So the writing was not actually what I wanted to be doing at that particular time. And the disappearance of that USB stick, which is literally a disappearance, was kind of like the universe stamping its foot down, saying, that chapter is officially over, and it's time to continue on a different course. So I'll just wait for these people to pass. And so the life-changing state that I was continuing to experience. It was bolstered somewhat further by that USB stick experience, and the intrigue I talked about in the previous chapter was just further intensified, and I now realise that it was kind of like the progression of the rearrangement of my brain. It's the only way that I can kind of describe it, like a neuronal rearrangement. Just took that little bit step, just was progressed a little bit further. And it was around this time as well that I started to find myself paying attention to like universal signs, and it was based on feeling, which is an extension upon the Lynn Grabhorn book that I've mentioned, and rather than like anything in my life that said, okay, now you need to do this. It was just this intuitive process, and then I just found myself paying attention to what I came to realize are universal signs, and I'll talk about, I guess, a significant early one, or a number of them, later in this episode. Now, the thing about that supermarket experience is that I think in my previous life I would have been left with a sense of loss or shame potentially, and just like it would have demoralized me. But at the same time, I never had an experience like that in my previous life, so it's almost like it's not really worth discussing or even considering. And what it did leave me with, though, is this lingering deep feeling that I needed to seek someone or something out. I had no idea. It was a complete mystery as to what or who that was, but that's what the ultimate impact of that significant experience was and has been. So what I did in terms of the work part of my life is I just tied up all the editing and writing clients that I had, in addition to ceasing the creative writing that I was trying to do. And that kind of was it. It took a little bit of time, and then just ceased it completely without even like I had no doubt. I had no doubt or uncertainty regarding that decision, when in the previous like 6 or 7 years that would have been a huge deal, and something that I would have like pored over and deliberated over, for a long while. But on this occasion it was it just made complete sense, and it went along fine. I had a bit of money from those clients to kind of tide me over, but I was able to then take a 6-month period of leave, and just to work on my health, and I received like government payments for that period of time. And amazingly, the timing of that 6-month period then allowed me to find the resources to fund the launch of Inward Markings. But the timing, like if you wrote the timeline on like a document, it just fit perfectly in with everything. It was it's interesting, that's for sure. So it was just like it was important to strip away all that stuff, and then I was to have a significant dream, which I'll talk about in another chapter, that would then further bolster what I was the decision to leave behind the editing and the writing. So interestingly, after that second ghost experience, I became really, obviously, or probably like most people, just fascinated by the idea of ghosts and so forth. and late one night went to get something from a service station that I often get like cheap coffee at and stuff, and just felt compelled for some reason to just ask the guy behind the counter whether he had ever had any experience with ghosts. And he said, if you asked me prior to 2 weeks ago, I would have just said, I would have laughed you off. But 2 weeks ago, I had my first ever ghost experience. And he said that he was working at a different service station in an adjacent suburb, and someone came in and reported like observing a mother place a young child in like a clothing bin where donations get left, and they're these large steel square bins, and you can't see into them, but they just have this like shutter that you place the clothes in. And so obviously he's just like startled by this. The person who reported, I think it was a woman, left her mobile number with the guy. He then went over, opened the shutter door, and this is how he described it. He said that he saw like a young child of about, not a baby, but a young child of about 12, the face of the young child appear in the slot and then sink down, and he said it freaked him out, so as it would anyone, and he called the emergency number, and both the police and the fire people arrived. They opened the bin and there was nothing or no one in there, and then they called the number that was left, and look, there's another bird, for God's sakes. The person who reported it came down and explained what she'd seen, and then it was just left at that. Now, I have gone back and spoken to that staff member, even like last week, and I've just continually asked, please, are you messing with me? Is this just something you've made up, etc.? And he's been adamant all along. So this is like, August last year that he first told me, and he's just adamant that it's 100%. So take it as you will, but it's just the timing of that was startling for me. And so now you will see. I'll talk about the universal signs in the next bit. Okay, so it turns out there's only one universal hint during that August 2018 period to discuss. It was while rereading this Tom Robbins book, Fierce Invalids Home from Hot Climates, which I first read about 15 years ago, but I gave away my personal copy soon after that. It's a book that was on my mind like around the time that I left Bangkok and came back to Melbourne, and I just resigned myself to rereading it at some point. But then I feel like the universe brought it to me. I was on one of my walks and went into a secondhand bookstore, and there was a copy. I don't typically reread books, but it just felt important to reread this. And so I was sitting here at one of the benches at a local park, and each bench has like a plaque remembering someone who'd passed. But it felt important to sit at this particular one. And while I was reading an eloquent description by the protagonist of a woman and her beauty, I felt compelled to look up. And a woman walking a dog was staring directly at me as she was walking kind of past at an angle. And the setting sun, because it was nearing dusk, was directly behind her head. So the rays of the sun were emanating from around the circumference of her head. And so I couldn't see the sun. I could only see her kind of like glowing with this kind of Statue of Liberty like halo around her. And she was staring directly at me. And it was akin to the description that I'd just been reading in the book. And that like it may come across as something that's not significant, but that definitely felt significant. And then another ghost experience occurred and my body started to reject meat. Okay, see ya.